Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, estes nostra salve.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would have not let his house be broken into. You also must be prepared, for an hour that you do not expect the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" And the Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master has arrived finds doing so. Truly I said to you, I will put him in charge of his property. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' and begins to beat the manservants and the maidservants, to eat and drink and get drunk, then that servant's master will come on an unexpected day in an unknown hour, and will punish the servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. That servant who knew his master's will, but did not make preparation nor act in accord with his will be beaten severely. And the servant who was ignorant of his master's will, but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating, shall be beaten only lightly. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more." The Gospel of the Lord.
In our first reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans today, St. Paul reminds us that we need to be careful about who we serve and who we allow to have control over us, or you could say what we allow to have control over us. And he reminds us that we can be either a slave of sin, which is a slave of the devil, or we can be a slave of righteousness. And when you go down that road as a slave of sin, at some point you lose complete control of your free will, because the enslavement leads you and holds you in a type of bondage. St. Paul says it a little better in the chapter that follows this one, where he talks about how I don't even know why I do the things I do. I do the things I don't want to do, and I can't even understand that. This is what he says sin does to us. And so what happens is we develop some kind of mental disorder in sin. We're not able to choose anymore, or we're not able to choose rationally. And we start doing things that we know we shouldn't do, and we know that are destructive, but we can't help ourselves. And St. Paul reminds us that when we serve Jesus, we're servants in freedom. He sets us free. And his desire is that we would serve him so that we can embrace everlasting life, not a lesser quality of life, but a better life. As he says, I have come that you might have life and have it in abundance. And he says that in a sense, St. Paul tells us that whatever we choose to serve, we actually use our bodies as either weapons of righteousness, or weapons of sin and death. And that's your choice. And weapons of righteousness as I'm a weapon for Christ. Can you imagine having the satisfaction of by obedience knowing that you're beating up the devil every day as a weapon of righteousness. Isn't that a cool thought? I'm a weapon for righteousness. Jesus says at some point the master's going to come home. And you see this in the series here on the master coming home when the slaves do not expect him. And so now comes the point of reckoning, where at some point it will be determined, are we a slave of the master of the house? The master of the house being your heavenly Father and King? Are you a slave of him? Because if you're not, then you're a slave of the other one, and you're hurting people in the household, and he has to deal with you. He has to deal with you because he's concerned for his children. And if you've chosen not to be a child of God and become a slave of the evil one, then he has to deal with that because it hurts everybody else in the household. In the same way as responsible parents would not let anything come into the house to hurt their children, then our Heavenly Father feels the same way about us. And so at some point, the master of the house comes home, and he has slaves that are hurting the other members of the household, and they must be dealt with. At first reading of this whole list of the conduct of the servants, it almost seems like the master is cruel. If he were not to take decisive action against the ones who are hurting his household members, that would be even more cruel. And so he acts. However, it does not have to come to that point. Instead, St. Paul is reminding us, and Jesus is saying it in a slightly different way, that if we're servants of him, conducting the household properly and acting according to life and all its abundance, the household will be well and good for everyone. And you are making yourself an eternal household in heaven.
Regina Celi,